Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the World War II Daily Podcast with me, your host, Pietro Deserti, and later I'll be joined in the actual recording of the episode by Samuel De Corti. This is a very special episode, and that's why it has this different intro. We interviewed Theodore Roosevelt Britton Jr., a World War II veteran, and a very special one. You're going to get to know his story soon, so I don't want to touch that for now. Um, it was an honor and a pleasure to interview Tad, and we learned so much. We are very thankful for him to dedicate his time to us and to share his knowledge with us. And me and Samuel, we hope that you learn as much as we learned from him. We are very happy that this happened to us. Again, it was an honor to have an actual World War II veteran in our show. Don't follow to subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us. When you subscribe, you help us a lot. It's free, and if you change your mind, you just unfollow, right? So please click that subscribe button and help us. You can also find us on Instagram as usual at World War Two underscore daily and at Samuel.decorti, right? Again, I hope you all enjoy this episode, and I'll see you on the other side of the episode to thank you. Right? Bye bye, guys. Enjoy the interview. I'll see you soon.
And now
Oh
you, yes,
yes,
yes, yes, yes, because I noticed it had a line on it. Yes. Hmm.
perfect. Yeah.
Yep. So there I am in the corner in the red shirt. Yes. Hmm.
So, would you like to tell us introduce yourself to us? Tell us a little bit about you, like your name, your about your life. Um,
Okay. My full name is Theodore Roosevelt Britton Jr. As you know, I'm from and I was born in South Carolina. Came to New York in 1936. That would be previously known as New Amsterdam. And Roosevelt obviously is an old name from the Netherlands. So we have lots of names up there that are synonymous. But I came to New York, I was 10 years old. And whereas I had spent my first 10 years in the South being restricted from everything that was public to some extent, suddenly coming to New York, I found all of these libraries, museums, art galleries, and so forth, and I could go to them free without any hesitation or racial restrictions and all that business. And it was like being in heaven. But I was in New York for the next 8 years before being called in the military service. But in the meantime, the people up there treated me like royalty. They were so wonderful to me. One gentleman said that, Britain, I want you to be a gentleman and a scholar. And for 3.5 years in high school, he continually pushed that towards me and what have you. So by the time I reached the South again, I was seasoned for both cultures. But even so, in the military, we were protected to some extent because we were in the military. Um, at first, it was a high preponderance of whites preaching us, but gradually it changed as more and more became experienced, knowledgeable, and so forth. Keep in mind that we were introduced to cannons, howitzers, mortars, um, rifles, bayonets, close order drill, discipline. We had the best of food, 3 meals a day. Plus, we also had the what else? Medical treatment any morning that you wanted to get it, and so forth. And basically, all we had to do was exercise and get a salary, get a check each month. Yeah. So from that, and after about, let's see, from January to end of June, we were there at this huge camp, and from there we went overseas. Now, by the way, you remember, Samuel, you'll remember that we had Dutch Marines training with us. I'm still trying to get some closer relationship with that. I did get the photos, by the way, which wonderful. What's the name? Elfrida sent them to me, but it showed the Dutch Marines with Marine U.S. Marine Corps uniforms and the Dutch royal insignia at the top, as well as on the connect, I guess around the neck or something like that. But this started my 30 in July 3rd. I started a 33-day trip from Norfolk, Virginia to the British Solomon Islands, passing, by the way, through Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. And from there, about 8 months later, we transferred up to Hawaii. While at sea, I learned the death of President Roosevelt. And I spent 2 years, 4 months, 16 days altogether in the Marine Corps and was back to San Diego and discharged. But I rejoined in 1948. I felt that I'd be going into the military, into government at some point. So that's why I rejoined the military to accumulate governmental credits. And I was recalled to active duty in October of 1950 in the Korean War. But I applied for a commission and passed everything until they found that I had opposed the Marine Corps' new policy of denial. They would not let us join headquarters would not let African Americans join all Marine Corps organizations. We were restricted merely to, in this case, they wanted to offer a trucking company, and so I'm not a trucker. So that used to be an old dance in Harlem, by the way. Another Dutch name, Harlem. Anyway, when they found out I had opposed them and forced them to change, they stopped the interview and walked out on me. So shortly thereafter, I was back at college finishing my degree, and everything has been since. But one thing is, when I was in the Solomon Islands, I came upon what was called the Anglo American Caribbean Commission, which was a group I found later on was set up so that America could guard the islands and the British territories because the British were fighting for their lives over in Germany. I mean, over in Europe. And remember that Hitler's army had roared across the Netherlands, Belgium, right into France. In fact, they came around the Maginot Line, and luckily, the Nazis made a decision because Goering was so overbearing. Of course, he was a big man anyway, but he was so overbearing. He insisted that the Luftwaffe be the one to conquer England. And so the Nazi army was stopped at the shores of France, but it gave the British a chance to escape. As it is, our commanding officer at the camp where I was trained was a man who had been trained in embarkation and debarkation. And so he was part of a team that was sent to the North Atlantic to help evacuate the British government in case the Nazis took over. And anyway, I became interested in diplomacy. And let's see, I guess it's something like almost 35 years later. I finally reached my goal in life, and that was to become a member of the diplomatic service as ambassador to old Barbados and Grenada and U.S. Special Representative to others. But having gained the rank of ambassador, from that point on, I was a diplomat forever. I could
That's
tell you a lot of other things I did banking, commission missionary, um, head of research and technology in the government, and so forth. And interestingly, the reason I came to Holland, if I can use both terms, the reason I came was because I had a colleague who was accustomed to bringing youngsters over with the International Christian Youth Exchange in Valschoten. And at one point, he had a conflict, and he asked if I'd be interested in going over to Europe to take the youngsters over. And I readily agreed because I had planned on going to Europe from my days as a teenager in high school. And so I made it my business to go to Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, Liberia, Ghana, Morocco, Nigeria, and so forth. Yeah. So that was
That's
my first great trip abroad. Yeah.
great. Do you want to go on, Sam?
Yes. Now that was a camp. What had happened, of course, is the Marine Corps had been typically on ships and in embassies as security guards, and yet they were beginning to. And of course, they served in World War II overseas, but as part of an army unit. So the warfare was beginning to change, and this particular gentleman who was our camp commander at Montford Point had been one of the innovators in terms of new fighting for the Marine Corps. They, for some reason, envisioned that it was going to be a type of island warfare in which they'd have to go from island to island. So he had become an expert on amphibious warfare. That's what they called it. And that's why this land was purchased, the land that later became known as Camp Lejeune. Um, it was designed to allow ships to come to the shoreline, to disembark, to take off weapons, food, all kinds of supplies, and even to set up island hospitals or island sites whereby people would be treated for wounds or casualties would be treated on shore rather than being brought back to the ships for treatment. Um, so this piece of land was purchased in southeastern North Carolina. And what else? They, they were beginning to get it underway. It was purchased in 1940, and right after that, the war broke out. So it was time to start using it. Okay, we had taken a part of it to be as a special training campsite for African Americans. We had been excluded, African Americans had been excluded for something like 147 years from the Marine Corps. It was all white or Caucasian, you might say. And a certain piece of it, extreme right of it, piece of it, was set aside as a training site for us, the new arrivals. At that time, discrimination, segregation, Jim Crow, whatever you want to call it, was legal in the United States. And so it was against the law to mix black Americans with white Americans. And so it was set up as this special camp. It had formerly been a camp used during the Depression years, um, a site used during Depression years for young Americans to give them a place to work and at the same time become young men and so forth. Um, that was the same place set up for us. And right after that, they began to develop it in earnest, and it was named after a former commandant of the Marine Corps. His name was Jean Lejeune, and that's how it became Camp Lejeune. But okay, at this particular camp, although the Marine Corps had been exclusive, suddenly this gentleman, Colonel Samuel A. Woods, came along. He brought with him 23 officers and 90 enlisted men to help train us new arrival, new recruits, African Americans. So For some reason, I always have a problem with with segregation because it connotes something that's inferior or second class or something. The the Since we had both black Americans and white Americans, it seems odd that we call ourselves segregated when Paris Island, the principal training camp, was all white, and it was in a small place. Oh, not anywhere as large as where we were. And the other place was San Diego, which was all white again. So something gets a little mixed up there. I think the culture dictated that if it had one black person in it, it was automatically inferior, which to you modern young people would say that sounds crazy. How can you put one with 113 and it's inferior and take him out and it's superior?
Mm,
It just doesn't make sense, but I'm ahead of the time because I've had more time to think about it.
mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what was your training like? Could you tell us a bit about this?
Basically, it was close order drill and basically exercises. Um, the last part of it, of course, was firing on the rifle range. But for about 3 months, a little bit less than 3 months, it was strictly one of close order drill. And from there into schools company to be taught things. I don't remember very much about the schools company, although schools training, although I'm very much interested in education. It just seemed to be that it was sort of a repetition thing of going through and maybe I already knew how to type, write, uh, and everything. I was at the point of graduating from high school when I was called in the Marine Corps. And by the way, when I was drafted, we had a selective service at that point. I was offered the Army or the Navy, and I said neither. And they said, "What do you want?" And I said, "The Marine Corps." And they said, "Well, the Marine Corps has a quota, and that quota is already filled." And I said, "Well, uh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember exactly what my words were." But they recognized that I wanted the Marine Corps. And so one Marine Corps recruiter spoke up and said, "Let me see what I can do." He went away and returned a few minutes later and said, "You're in." And that was it. That's how I became a Marine. Why I changed, I don't really know, but I always think of my father who had a very limited education, but he had given up everything he knew in the South, however menial it was, to go to New York and join his brother. At that time, New York City was building its metro system, and he came up there to join, and he lived in the black community, which is Harlem, by the way. It's changed, by the way. You hardly find a black person in that community these days. But anyway, he joined and relocated in the community, sent for myself, my two sisters, and my mother to join him up there. And right after we arrived, the bottom dropped out of the economy and he lost his job, and we had to move downtown, which was a predominantly white section. So suddenly, from growing up under an old set of black educators, I was suddenly under all white educators, and I thrived under both of them. So by the time I went into the military, I was accustomed to living, dealing, and learning from people of all kinds of backgrounds. In addition, because we moved on the west side of Manhattan, New Amsterdam to you foreigners, um, because I was living on the west side, I was near the sea, the shipping areas. And so I began first just walking out of curiosity, and later I began to shine shoes for a living. And I would go down along the thing, passing the Hamburg line, the Canard line, the Dutch line, all of the French line, all of the Italian line, all of those that were using ships at that time for transport coming to the States. Um, and I got to know many people because as I'd stop to shine shoes from some, especially many of the sailors. We'd get into conversation, and I began to learn a lot about them, their countries, and so forth. And so I was early introduced to international things, and that was the way things started out. I became, let's see, in my desire for public service, which was developing at the time, I thought about religion as a focus of my efforts, but I wasn't quite comfortable with that. So I wanted to do something to help people, and so I began to do more in the communities, including at a church in Harlem that had been it had its pastor had become the second black congressman in that era in the time. Um, we had 435 representatives. There were two African Americans in it, although we constituted about, maybe about 15% of the population. Today it's quite a larger number. It's about 53 or 55, and, and as well as about four members of the 100-member Senate and so forth. So there continued to be, well, changes. I go back a little bit. I just sent off a note to the head of this association of former members who signed on, who were at Montford Point, and I pointed out to them that the public relations person is sending out a notice that said that we were fighting for racial equality. Well, I'm uncomfortable with that, and he thinks it's the greatest thing to be. Well, if you're fighting for racial equality, it assumes that you're unequal, that you don't have equality. And I don't know of anyone who would have said that I'm unequal. Secondly, to the extent that this is a huge country, how would you know it when you achieved it? So I sent a little note and said that I think you might choose a better word. Number one, there was a war going on, and while we were not satisfied with the rights that were being extended by the major population, we were also interested in helping our country and showing our patriotism. We were patriots first and foremost, and beyond that, whatever rights we could achieve at the same time, because there was a circulation that we were inferior, we couldn't do this and couldn't do that, and yet I said in retrospect that the reason we were trained at a separate camp was we didn't show the white Marines up by excelling in front of them, which would have created another problem because being in low numbers, we could have been massacred. Lynchings, killings, brutalizing were, if not tolerated, they were not exactly pursued in terms of punishment for those who lynched African Americans or whatever. So things were changing, but your view of it can change as you get older. I have a saying: "Too soon we get old, and too late smart." Actually, it is a German phraseology. Too soon we get old, and too late smart. So that's the way things developed.
I am amazed with your memory. Oh my god, so many details. Like you remember precisely like the places and the things. Very good. Um, I would like to ask you, where were you, and how was the moment you got to know that Pearl Harbor was under attack and things were going down?
I was about to leave for my school at the time, and radio was popular. I still listen to the radio quite a bit. I heard that the Japanese had been attacked, and I had to walk about, let's see, about 13 blocks to get to school. You know, the block is about, normally is about, I would say about 50 yards on the west end of it. And on the south end, it was about 100 or so yards. You know what? They were rectangles, streets. But I had to walk about 13 of them to get to my school. And on my way up, I remember I was thinking about what happens now. And of course, the next day, um, it was announced the same day that the president would be coming on the air to speak the next day. And that's when he made his famous Day of Infamy speech. And by that time, I had also been keeping very close touch with what was going on in Europe, um, because I had had an interest in France from my first days in high school. I just assumed that the day would come when I'd be going to France, and so I began studying French. And then during the course of it, I began to hear about a country called Liberia. There was a man who was promoting Liberia. I shouldn't say man, he was a young man like the rest of us in high school. And he talked about going back to Africa and setting up a great African empire. Um, okay, that was his thought. But then we ran into a problem. He said in order to be a member of the group, you had to look African. Well, I don't know what an African look is, but it was assumed that you had to have a dark skin. And well, he announced that certain people, some very prominent people in public life, Adam Clayton Powell and Walter White, the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, were all very light complexion. And so I guess, among others, began to feel uneasy that he was going to be looking at us and put us out. But the organization kind of fizzled after that. But once I returned to the U.S. from the war, um, I became active in public matters concerned about what was going on in the community and what have you. And that led me to the Boy Scouts, and then some conversation with some of the boys who were older than I, who knew a lot more about public life, who had not been in public service but had begun studying at colleges and what have you. And my vistas began to broaden quite a bit. That's how I began to move into public life and think about some of the things. I favored the intervention in Korea for the free. By the way, I had begun watching the United Nations affairs while overseas. I was about 18 and 19 years old, but I began to follow everything that happened with the United Nations. The fact that 51 nations formed the United Nations in San Francisco, and look at it today, 193 nations. And of course, there always a question: where did they come from? Well, interesting. Getting back to Montford Point in Camp Lejeune, the the Americans welcomed the Dutch Marines at first, but they found that the Dutch was training those Marines to attack Indonesia. And for some reason, the Americans were uncomfortable with that. As you know, Indonesia is a huge country by comparison with the Netherlands, and the Netherlands did not have a government except in exile in England. And so the Americans began to sour on the aspirations of the Dutch. As it happened at the end of World War II, because the Netherlands did not have a functioning government or functioning army as such, it was asked that the Japanese retain control of Indonesia until the Netherlands got on its feet. Okay, but it happened that the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time that the Dutch Marines came to train with us had served in China twice. And the American Marines used to get into fights with the American Army men as well as others. And Yet the Dutch Marines sided with the Americans because they were both Marines and used to fight alongside them against the others. So the commandant had a warm feeling about Dutch Marines. And so he was able to keep them in training. And there was a place called Camp Davis, which I only learned about recently, that was an adjunct of Camp Lejeune. That's how the Dutch got to be trained as Marines over here. Yeah. You live and learn every day. Yeah.
So you were mentioning the Marine Corps, and I was wondering in which unit did you serve during the Second World
Oh,
War?
all right. All right. Here's what happened. When the Marine Corps first welcomed us back, when the Marine Corps first welcomed us into the Marine Corps, they had decided that they would take in 1,000 of us, and then they reduced it to 900. 200 from the east, 200 from the central part, that's Chicago and what have you, and 500 from the south. And the assumption was that by getting us from the south, they would get men who were more submissive, who were humble, and so forth. And they were going to go up to at 900, and they were going to put us in what was called a composite defense battalion. Actually, there were at that time 11 Marine Corps defense battalions, and ours was named the 51st. First, I'm sure that they were going to make it the Colored Defense Battalion, but that name didn't go over too well. So they changed it to the 51st, and it said that the colonel who came up with that name looked in his wallet and pulled out a $5 bill with the picture of Lincoln on it. And he pulled out a $1 bill with the picture of George Washington on it. And that inspired him to name this Colored Defense Battalion as the 51st. Okay. But coming from the South, the East, and the North, these men who were supposed to be humble, by the way, well educated, required that you be either a college graduate or a high school graduate. Um, these men were suddenly trained to fire cannons, to drive tanks, to float balloons, to bring down planes, to fire mortars, howitzers, rifles, and so forth, and to have bayonets. The other thing is that whereas men from the South were expected to lower their eyes or to be submissive and so forth, suddenly were required to look a person directly in the eyes, and secondly, to speak up. Whereas they'd mumbled before, they were required to speak up. So this was an entirely different African American that were trained as a Marine. So whenever people say that we were fighting for equality, I think that most of us felt equal from the start. But being Marines and being taught all these new weapons made us even more equal. So, men who walked down the street who used to step off the street when a white person was coming, step off the sidewalk when a white person was coming, now had such strides that they were walking so fast they would get past them before they even knew they were there. But also, you had to walk with your chin in, chest out, shoulders back, stomach in. You, as Jesse Jackson used to say, you were somebody. You were somebody because you were a Marine. Yeah, yeah. And the Army knew it too, yeah, as well as the Navy.
So yeah, I was just checking here the 51st. You served just
Oh,
to be
there.
sure. You
I
go ahead.
forgot. I forgot it. Yes, the Marine Corps quickly ran out of billets because the selective service law stipulated that at least 10% of the military should be African American because that was a part of the population. So here it was, the Marine Corps had planned on 900 men, which was like nothing. So then they had to come up with another one, and they labeled that the 52nd Defense Battalion. But the Marine Corps started out with something like 54,000 men altogether. And by 1945, it was up to 450,000. Well, the total number of African Marines taken in was 19,268. They were very short. So the question is, since there was less and less of a need for a defense battalion, what were they going to do with the African Americans? They didn't want to integrate them into the divisions, nor in some of the other areas, especially the Air Force and what have you, Air Wing. They came up with a plan to have ammunition companies to bring ammunition on because there was a specialty with loading ammunitions on a ship and taking ammunition off a ship, as well as setting up an ammunition dump on a conquered piece of territory without killing yourself. You can do the right thing and end up with ammunition blowing up and you're gone. Well, they started that off, and then they also found that men who used to have to leave the battle lines to eat, clothes, get new ammunition, so forth, were leaving the battlefront, and that meant that the others left there were vulnerable to the enemy, and so they came up with something called a depot company. Americans don't really know the original meaning of depot, except that it was, supply units. But at that point, they began to form a depot company to support the men on the battlefront. Okay. I was in the 27th Marine, they call it Marine Depot Companies. Okay. But in the course of it, since quite often the fighting became intense and the men who were going up to the battlefront to bring supplies and food and maybe clothes and what have you also were asked to bring back the casualties, the wounded, or the bodies of deceased men who had been killed in action. And sometimes when the fighting was intense, they were asked to come to the front lines and fire their weapons at the enemy and so forth. Interestingly, at times I felt sorry for the decision making because men who did not even qualify on the rifle range, meaning high shooters, had to be up front firing at the enemy, and they were being supplied with ammunition by other men who had qualified as expert riflemen on the rifle range. They were supplying ammunition to the men who could hardly see in front of them. But those are some of the decisions that are made sometime, and they think about it afterwards. A little bit late, but it costs a lot of people their lives. Um, as I say, I served overseas with the 27th Depot Company, and mine was administration. And so I was always associated with the office and with officers. And because they were basically college trained or college exposed, I learned a great deal from them. And I also felt free to call upon them whenever I had a question, which they were happy to answer because if they were in the army, I mean, in the office and not out on the field, they were more in an intellectual environment, and so they were happy that I asked them lots of questions. I We also had what was called the United States Armed Forces Institute on the island, and they were getting all kinds of books. And I'm a bookworm, so I was grabbing every book that I could get my hands on. I still have two of them that were issued during World War II. One's called the Give Yourself Background, and among other subjects, it said Master Geography and Master Politics and Master Your Health and master your knowledge of another language and all kinds of suggestions, even what we call the Reader's Digest. You may have heard of it. It's a publication that is still being published monthly, as far as I know. But at that time, it was the principal things. It preceded magazines like Life and Look and those kinds of monthly magazines and so forth. Yeah, at a time before we had audio and visual, you had to just read and read and read. And I did an awful lot of reading, obviously, but that was the term of my service overseas, principally in administration. And I used to have to. I did the monthly muster roll of officers and enlisted men. So in those days, if you made a mistake typing, you almost had to start over because we did not have what with the printing presses of today or the small printers. We had the word it escapes me, but it was something whereby when you typed, the typing made an imprint into the wax coating on the paper, and that's where you later on when you ran it through a certain thing, it printed out this thing on paper. Um, um, but as I say, if you made a mistake earlier, there was no way to correct it. So I had to make sure that I remembered everything. Sometimes a person's serial number, one specialty naming number, the way he spelled his name. And if he had an unusual name, I had to remember that. I remember one of my first sergeant's middle name was Zelza. Well, you don't see that name around very much. And another's name was Estus, Esthus. And so that was those are whenever I would call those men later on after they had gotten out of the military and I would pronounce their middle names, they would say there's only one person in the world but except my mother and she's gone who remembers that name. And he says that's gotta be that damn Briton. So it used to amuse me to call them and call them by their middle names. Yeah. But again, my service was in the depot company. I did not go into the battle. And years later, I used to meet with the OECD in Paris on a regular basis and got to know many of the men from. There were 24 nations, by the way, and I got to know so many of them, especially from Netherlands and what have you, because coming out of New York, there was sort of a kinship that I knew that most of the others there did not know. With the Netherlands, I had I had served up in an area called well, let's see, no, yeah, it was called the Schouwengunk Mountains, and it was an area that was strictly speaking all Dutch, and so all of the areas up there was it's infiltrated with the Dutch settlers. So I had this kinship and got along well with the fellows. In fact, between them and I guess the Danes, I was very close to them because one of my good friends was a man who had been captured by the Nazis 3 times and had escaped 3 times. And I didn't know all of this about him initially, but we began to get to know each other. And I had friends in Denmark who had also were Jewish and who had been hidden by the Danes during the um, during the war. Because I was from New York, which has a huge Jewish population, when I would go to Europe, my friends would always ask me to look up this one and look up that one and whatever. So I had friends waiting for me in Europe whenever I went, and I would get over about 3 or 4 times a year, hmm and that was about it, I guess. Mhm.
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
Um,
Uh,
do you
Uh,
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
I was wondering, because you served overseas, you served in these depot companies. Can you tell us a bit more about what these companies did, what you did while you were overseas?
All right. Um, according to the statistics, 30% of the military are engaged in the actual fighting, and 70% serves as support. Okay. Uh, Typically, the Marine Corps had no kind of support units. They had to do everything themselves. This meant that medical treatment, supplies, cooking, and all of those things, they had to kind of scramble to find to do it because basically they were on ships. As a result, the ships had the medical people, the ships had the food, and so forth. And so, but came the new type of warfare going from island to island, and some of the islands were quite large. For example, Guam or the Solomon Islands in New Guinea and what have you. They had to have stationary places whereby they could support the units on the front line, and so they had to start devising ways of utilizing the medical there. In Guadalcanal, for example, I roomed with medical corpsmen, and 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 in addition, as I say, on the battlefront, quite often the men who were sent to bring supplies to the men on the battle lines found themselves having to fight alongside the same ones. Um, Typically, every Marine had the specification of being a rifleman. That was the basic specialty of every Marine. And so, although you had to bring clothes or shoes or socks or underwear, food, water, and so forth, and ammunition to the men on the front lines, the fact is you were indeed a rifleman, and most Marines feel that they must be involved in the fighting, although they recognize they don't, of course, that you could get yourself killed up there. I have a goodly number of friends who hold the United States Medal of Honor, and they, of course, we talk a lot about their experiences in addition up there. And last but not least, I hold the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the oldest medal awarded in the U.S. military. George Washington was the first recipient, and he received it for being the first American officer to capture a city from the British, and that was Boston, Massachusetts. But at first it was just for military people, and later it was expanded to give it to people from all countries who otherwise satisfied the requirements of the medal. And I guess that's pretty much about it. As I say, with the ammunition companies, they had to have special training because it's one thing to bring ammunition forward. It's another thing to get it off a ship and to get it on a small boat and to get it off a small boat on land and to set up a place whereby there could be repositories or depositories of these munitions. And you're worried about them being hit by enemy fire as well as by being in an area where they might ignite a spark or something and blow up. So even so, the the depot companies, while they had something like 163 men, and they were all black by and large, African Americans, the they always had about 4 to 6 officers who were all white. It wasn't until 1945 that the first African American was commissioned and simultaneously discharged because there was a regulation that no black person could be superior to a white person in the Marine Corps. It um, and yet with the ammunition companies, there were white enlisted men because these were seasoned veterans who knew how to handle munitions, explosives, without necessarily allowing the men to get killed or something like that. So, but and this started in 1942. President Truman issued his desegregation order in 1948. And when I remind people that the Marine Corps was desegregated, not officially, but especially in the depot companies and the ammunition companies from 1942, it astounds them. They can't see that the Marine Corps was integrated from 1942. But if the culture tells you that something is not true, it can be the exact opposite in front of your eyes, but you believe it and you accept it, and you can't argue against it. But it, it's something. My wife and I were just talking about the church services, um, whereby one group specifically talks about the ethereal things and the spiritual things, which you can't argue because there are men who are trained to argue you. And so when they talk about these things as if they were day to day happenings, and they're supposed to impress you because that's that's what they know and what you don't know, so you accept it. But if you raise questions, when I was in the Marine Corps, the preacher was talking about the devil and how the devil was going to do this and do that and what have you. And I raised the question that if the Lord is so powerful, how can there be a devil doing this and doing that? And so he said, "What? You don't believe it?" And I just asked a question. He put me out of the church. That was the first time I had been put out of a church. There's certain things you're not supposed to ask, especially if the one you're questioning doesn't have an answer.
Mm.
Yeah, yes, Em, go ahead.
I was actually curious because I found a bunch of photos from the Marine Corps, um,
Yes.
and I
Rather young to graduate at that age. Anyway, who are these for people?
yeah, I had a lot of photos, and I was
Yes.
actually curious because maybe this sparks some memory. And
Um, these are before my time.
mm,
By the time I came in,
mm,
they they were doing some of this, but I
mm,
was not exposed to it. Yeah. I see the men are using this looks like a grenade launcher or something like that. And I'd never seen or worked with any of those things. In fact,
mm,
from my days, this is a machine gun, I think.
mm,
From
yeah,
my days after being in boot camp, as they
mm,
call it, mine was pretty much administrative wise, so I was not exposed to any of the field activities as
mm.
such. Yeah. Mhm.
What about close order drill that you mentioned?
Oh yes, that's
Yeah.
very much part of what I was doing.
Mm,
Um, as a matter of fact, in my days in working in the office, interestingly, because I was working in the office, I was anxious to get back to that and away from the field thing. So quite often, you remember what was called the Eisenhower jackets at the time?
mm,
The the kind of green jackets with all the Um,
mm,
but invariably, I would have a book inside my jacket, and I would always try to get in the rear row, the back row of the formation. And when the officers were inspecting up front, I would simply pull out my book in the back row and start reading.
ah, just like you told us earlier that you love to read. Yeah.
And remember what I read.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. So these are a lot of photos,
Yes,
but this is from before your time, you mentioned.
yes. I'm
Mhm.
trying to remember who. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So,
Mm. Now this is one of the original photos with
mm,
Colonel Woods
mm,
inspecting some of the men, and this is an early one, as you can tell. If you notice how rustic the background is,
mm,
plus if you notice the men on the left are wearing green uniforms, and the ones on the right,
mm,
I guess they're wearing green uniforms, but also cartridge belts.
mm,
And the colonel is in the front. And as a matter of fact, they have the flag, I think, stuck in the soil. Um, it's one of the earlier photos. I guess this must have been taken in 1942
mm,
because you don't see any buildings of any sort in the background, and the trees are still growing. They're tall, but
mm,
young trees um, as such. And I don't see of any artificial construction in the background or any construction as such.
mm,
Yeah. So this goes back quite a length time, quite. But it's one of the very early photos. I think I have it in my collection. Otherwise, yeah.
mm.
But this is the colonel. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Colonel Samuel Alexander Woods Jr.
Mm,
I just received a notice from his older granddaughter who was acknowledging a note that I had sent, a
mm,
correction that I sent to someone who was doing an article on the colonel, and well, he was citing something he had received from the Marine Corps History Division, and I told him that the Marine Corps History Division is not very reliable. Thus far, they're giving out less information or something else. I don't know what it's all about. Yeah,
mm,
but it's not accurate. Yeah,
mm,
this is a group of let's see, newcomers, recruits arriving,
mm,
and that is the first building, one of the first two buildings on the campus, in the camp. This looks like it was the chapel.
mm,
I recall the chapel was combined with several other activities, the theater and whatever.
mm,
Hmm. But you notice some of the men are in
mm,
civilian clothes, yeah, and some are in uniforms, yeah.
mm.
Hmm.
So this
There's a group of
appears.
men. This is coming out of the chapel, I believe.
Mm.
Yeah.
You also attended religious services here?
Pardon me?
You also attended religious services here.
Yes, 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 yes,
Mm.
yes.
So that would be every Sunday, right?
Yes, every Sunday. There was a presumption that everybody was a Christian at that time. Yes, and this is. I remember the name of the man who was the chief chaplain. His name was Frederick Volbeda.
Mm.
Frederick Volbeda. Does that name sound sort of European?
Not exactly, but oh.
Yes. My correspondent, who was the granddaughter of the colonel,
Mm.
her last name was Logue, Logue. Yeah.
Mm.
Yes, her father was James T. Logue, a physician at the camp where he trained.
Mm.
Hmm. There's a gentleman. This might have been one of the judo instructors. He looks somewhat familiar, but he had gone a couple of years by the time I got there. I arrived rather.
Mm.
His name was, we called him Gator Bryant, a nickname for alligator.
Mm.
He was a judo instructor. This gentleman looks like a studious kind of person.
Mm.
And this is the early jackets. They were superseded by another kind of jacket, I think.
Mm.
hmm This is a cannon being shot, and I see some of the men are wearing the old style hats,
Mm.
sun hats. Yeah,
A similar photo.
yes. This is
More.
one of the. This is one of the
Mm.
boot. Or should I say, a recruit platoon in boot camp, and they're carrying M1. Let's see. No, that's not even the M1 Garand rifle. That may be with the old style infield rifle, which was used in World War II. Yes, because at the top it has the kind of thing that you pull back to pull the boot, the what do you call it, the right, the for the to pull the bullets forward, the rounds
Mm.
forward. Yes, I don't see a date next to this, so it's something that's
Mm.
hard to identify. But I would say this is early 1943.
Practice at the
This is-
rifle range.
Yes, I believe it is. Yes, it is in the rifle range. I see the targets in the background.
Mm.
Yes, yes. The whenever one would fire, um, and whenever one would hit the target or miss the target, they pull up a placard indicating whether you hit the target and what part of the target did you hit. If you miss the target, instead of the plaques that you're seeing there, you'll see a white flag, and we call that Maggie's Draws
Mm.
whenever you miss the target. Yeah.
More training exercises.
This is a training exercise out in the woods, and you can see the rustic type of training barrier used. Yeah.
Mm. And the
And
men are.
again, you notice the absence of shall we say, the absence of construction in the background. Yeah. Now I'm going to show you something quickly.
Mm.
Can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah. This was a publication done in 1945,
Mm.
in which it was it was set up to be distributed to the men.
Mm.
As it happened, for some reason they decided not to, and so some of the men kept some and sold them to us. So, but this one, let me show you something else.
It's a yeah.
Okay, and then I can show you a little bit more. One second.
No problem.
Let me see. Where's the?
Mm.
These
Hand-to-hand
are
combat.
a little bit more modern.
Yeah.
Yes, but go ahead. Let me see some of the other photos you have. Yeah.
More
Yes, that's
practice.
on, that's on the rifle range again.
Mm.
Yeah. And again, that particular rifle is just typical of the old rifles where you had to use your hand to pull back and put a new bullet in.
Mm.
The later ones we had a cartridge chamber under the rifle, and so when you fired one round, another would automatically come up into the chamber, and the spent bullet would be ejected.
Mm.
So this is the old rifle. This goes back then to about 1942 or maybe early 43. Again, you don't see, well, this is a rifle range, but again, and you can tell by the development of the camp whether what year it is.
Mm.
1940 and 41 would have been pretty much empty of any kind of construction.
Mm.
42 began to show a few more buildings, 43 a few more, and by 44 you began to see a
Mm.
considerable number.
Yeah.
But the land had the land, which is something like 256,000 meters. I mean, um, Italy, right. 39339 705 8738. I will call you back a little later. All right, I'm on the phone with the Netherlands. Okay, Dad.
Oh.
That was my daughter from Rome, Italy.
Mm.
Pietro.
Yeah. So another image from the rifle range.
Yeah, again, more from the rifle range.
Mm.
Yes, and you see two white. Yeah, you can tell that this is the early days because you still had white instructors um, who very basically was very much in need overseas because we had begun the march from Guadalcanal up towards Japan, and we still had white instructors who were needed because, as I said, the Marine Corps started off in 1941 with roughly 54,000 men, which is a very small number by comparison with how they ended up later on with 454,000. But these men had to quickly give up their roles, and the young men who are firing on the range now probably had to take their place within a couple of months or so. Mhm. Next, yeah, here's one showing his rifle.
More
We
practice.
didn't have any if we didn't have any protective gear for our ears at that time. So most of those men ended up having to get hearing aids at a very early age, by the way. This is this would be a cannon, I suppose. Again, you can tell by the absence of buildings in the background that it it it's still a rustic area. We had to remove 700 families from that particular huge expanse of land, which must have been about it must have been about between 12 and 23 miles, which is an awful. Not to mention cemeteries, they had to exhume bodies and remove them from the area. And I'm sure that there were many cemeteries which were missed because quite a number of cemeteries were not labeled or not labeled with permanent writings.
This fella seems to be having a lot of fun.
Well,
Hmm.
yes, at that time, because if you notice, weapons are being fired close to their ears,
Mm.
and at that point, being young and enjoying everything, why they could not tell the long term or even anticipate the long term effects. Yeah. By the way, the early arrivals were tested with the use of these cannons to see how they would shoot down a target flying overhead. Because originally, as I say, they were to be defense groups, and they quickly shot down these moving targets, which established them immediately as superior in terms of their training or their abilities based on their training. This is with bayonet training. Mm.
So this is an anti-aircraft gun.
Yes, yes, yes. I don't know the difference between a cannon, a howitzer, or a mortar. I was never trained on any of those items. Those weapons, I should say. Yeah, they're not items; they're weapons. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, yeah. Okay, that picture there. This can you flash back to the single picture? Okay, he was the first African American to arrive at this newly integrated Marine Corps. His name was Howard P. Perry. Yeah. Yes, he arrived on August 26, 1942.
Oh, well, okay. Very good memory again.
Yes, Howard P. Perry. Yeah.
but Alfreda will also have told you about her father, right?
About who?
About
Whose
her
father?
father?
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yes. Yes. He was the first one to enlist in the Marine Corps. He enlisted on June 1st, 1942, 1941. But you remember now, he did not come into the formally report to the base until a year and almost 5 months later, because the Marine Corps didn't have a site prepared, and again, to mix two races was against the law, not United States law, but it was in state law, and state law still pretty much ruled at that time. Yeah, but that's Howard P. Perry. This is the dining room, and if you notice the tables,
Everything's made of wood.
yes, 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 yes.
I'm
I have
curious.
a,
Yeah.
I have a friend who had to set up eating facilities and food for 35,000 men during the Desert Storm. It might have been Desert Storm, yeah. But in the course of it, I had to think about what he had to go through in order to find both the building, the tables, the cutlery, the food, and the water and other drinks, not to mention the cooks and the number of people who had to serve this kind of thing and so forth. It made me suddenly conclude that these men were entitled to medals maybe as much as the ones who were on the fighting front who killed a number of enemies, because without this kind of facility, the army would not have gone very far. Yeah.
It's true.
Hmm.
I'm curious.
Next one.
Do you have
Let's
any
see.
memories about the food? Like, what did you eat?
Better than what I was probably getting back at home, because when I went in, we were just recovering from the depression, whereby food and all other supplies were short. Whereas in the military, by the time I went in, everybody was getting the best of food, because remember, it was rationing, which meant that you only got a certain amount of certain kinds. And so I don't remember anything special about the food except that I was never hungry, that's for sure. And by the same token, when this colonel began to notice that many of the men who were arriving for recruit training were hungry, he couldn't understand, because they had been given vouchers. And what had happened is, because of the prejudice and the discrimination, many of the places would not only not accept the vouchers for cash, but they would not even allow the men to come into the restaurants to be fed. And so many of them had to make this long trip, sometime from California to North Carolina, which is 3,000 miles by train, or bus and could not find anything to eat. They also had vouchers for sleeping compartments. But again, because of the discrimination and the laws, they were not allowed to use the sleeping compartments, and so they had to sit up all night for sometimes 2, 3, or 4 nights. Yeah. Not only one last thing, of course, is that in one case, some of the men were going overseas, and when they stopped after an overnight travel and attempted to go into the restaurant would not allow them to come in, but at the same time, some Nazi prisoners were brought in and they would be allowed to go in and sit down at the tables and enjoy themselves. Whereas Americans in military uniforms and red, the stars and stripes on their uniforms were not allowed. They were turned away. Well,
Yes.
too soon
Yeah.
we get old and too late a bit smarter.
That's insane. It's insane.
Well, it's in today's view, but that was the extent of the humane influence on civilization. We're still evolving as a civilized people and so forth. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
still difficult to, well, sometimes see which way we're going because present day's needs, desires supersede tomorrow's effect. You might say
More men
this is
eating.
this is a dining room. Now you notice the hair is very short because typically when you arrived at the boot camp, they immediately cut your hair off. They would always give you a choice of how you wanted it cut, and then proceed to cut it all off.
Here they're listening to the radio.
Yeah, no, that's not a radio. That's a
Jukebox,
juke.
right?
Ah, that's the word.
Yeah.
A juke.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of Dutch, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah.
A jukebox.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. There. That's you will very rarely see something like that these days because people will either have telephones or they will have something earphones
Hmm.
and so forth. Yeah. But that's what we had in those days. And you know how close they're sitting together. There's a well, in this country, it tend to be a little bit more spacious. Yeah. And you see the three different kinds of caps they're wearing.
Hmm.
Yes,
So
I
you
was looking I was looking at that actually, the hats. You mentioned the hat before and I was looking to the hats right now.
yes. I'm trying to remember what they used to call them. I'm trying to think of the name of that particular hat. This this one that went and it's in front of the directly in front and to the right of the jukebox. Yeah. Yes, yes, that's one. Yes, yes. I think it used to be called a safari hat or something like that because they were associated with Africa and Livingston and Stanley and those kind of people. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So you use this as a form of recreation.
It's a form of what?
So you would use this during your time off. Like you would all
Yes,
listen to
yes, yes,
music together.
yes, yes. Um, there were two types of time off in the camp and time off outside of the camp.
Hmm.
If you were allowed outside of the camp, it was called liberty. Uh, but on the inside of the camp, it was, well, recreation would have been a rather high term, but the effect of this time off, yeah.
A similar
Here's
photo,
another,
yeah.
the same photo, yes. This is the library. Now, this gentleman who, and is in the center there, if I recall, he became one of the first six stripers. He was called a sergeant major and he trained under one of the best known educators in the country at times. Before coming into the Marine Corps, he was the chauffeur for Mrs. Roosevelt whenever she came to visit his college, and he was also her waiter
Mm,
whenever she ate or dined with his boss, the owner of the college
mm,
at that time, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune.
mm,
His name was Huger, Huger. These Dutch names prevail so much, and I'm thinking of Roosevelt and Huger
mm,
as if they were Brown or Smith or Jones
yeah,
or something.
mm,
Yes. Mhm. But
and
you can see how crowded the library is.
mm,
And it wasn't that they were posing because they were very seriously interested in what they were reading. You notice it?
mm,
Yeah. Now, if these were people who were less educated, they might have been more interested in what was going on around them or something, or staring out at the camera.
mm,
But in this case, they were truly and sincerely interested in what they seemed to be uh, that they was available to read. Yes.
mm.
Hmm.
More training exercises.
Yeah. That's the same one you
Yeah.
had before. Yeah.
Another
Yeah.
one. This is a.
That's again on the rifle range. Yeah. Now this must have been something different because they seem to be spread out a little bit more,
Mm,
uh, which um, would need some, I guess, some explaining or something to kind of decipher what they were doing.
mm,
They might have had heavier weapons. It might have been a machine gun, or maybe even I don't even know that we had grenade launchers in those
mm,
days. We had hand grenades,
mm.
but not grenade launchers as such. Yes, yes,
Hmm.
yes. That was something they used to talk about. You notice that they're training, taking judo training or
Mm,
something like that. Yes, one is being either knocked off his feet or something like
mm,
that. Yeah. And that was an area where you might come upon a snake in the
mm.
weeds or something. Yes, this is a now both of these men are not in recruit training. They're out.
Mm,
Yeah, and both of them are privates. All of us came in as privates,
mm,
and it it began to take some time before the ratings began to accelerate. But because of the discrimination, it meant that men had to were given promotions on an accelerated basis, and I think this must have created some jealousy, envy, or something like that on the part of men who had been in for years and years and years, but who had not been promoted over those years because of the limited number of people in the Marine
mm.
Corps. Suddenly, men who were just coming in a year later had 4 and 5 stripes, things which normally take you about 8 to 10 years to acquire.
Mm.
Go ahead, next one.
More of the judo exercises.
Yes, 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 yes. Now you notice that they're using tents.
Mm,
There's only one permanent building, permanent being maybe 3 or 4 years, but you have lots and lots of tents in the background there. Hmm.
baseball.
Yes, yes. Um, yep. One of the men on the baseball team became one of the first black Brooklyn Dodgers pitchers. His name was Dan Bankhead. These are boots,
Mm,
you might say. who had just gotten an issue of clothing. This is a warehouse
Mm.
here.
Similar photo. More judo exercises.
Yes, the man on the right, who is sort of the teacher, his name was Gaslow. His last name was Gaslow, A.L. Gaslow. He um, he had been a judo expert, jujitsu expert, before coming into the Marine Corps, and was used for training men in judo and jujitsu. Don't ask me what the difference is between the two terms. I'm not sure I remember.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Another one of.
Again, it's Howard Perry again, and that's the first time I think I've seen him with the stripe.
Hmm.
No, this you can tell is probably about 1948, late 1943
Hmm.
or early 1944, because you see a lot more permanent construction. Yes, yes. Now these two buildings here on the left foreground are still in
Hmm.
existence. This one is now the museum and the library of the Montford Point Marine Association,
Hmm.
and that particular camp is now known as Camp Johnson. Um, Gilbert H. Johnson was the first one to rise in rank. He had been in the Army and in the Navy for a total of 19 years. And so he wore service stripes on his left sleeve, which we called hash marks. And he himself had his nickname was Hashmark Johnson. The camp is now known as Camp Gilbert H. Johnson instead of Montford Point.
Hmm. This one we have
Again,
seen.
yes. And this is another one in which the flag is raised. This, I would say, is probably early 1943 because by that time they had put up a flagpole. But as you can see in the background, you don't see. There you see several buildings, but they're not they're not close by, and the place is pretty rustic. No streets
Hmm.
or sidewalks are laid out because cars were not prevalent at that time.
Hmm.
This man's name is oh gosh, what's his name? He was the piano the organist, and I have his picture here as well. He worked for the chaplain, and hold it a second. I'll have him up here in a moment. All righty. Walker Manley, Walker Howard
Hmm.
Manley. Yeah. Can you see him?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He was quite the person. He was quite well known in the camp because of his being the organist, um, which suggests that he was either classically trained or had been trained otherwise.
Hmm.
But he became a sergeant ultimately. Walker Howard
Hmm.
Manley. Hmm. And he served on the chaplain Volbeda. Yeah.
Hmm. This is an inspection, it seems.
I would presume it's some type of
Hmm.
inspection, yes. Yes. Mhm.
Do you have any recollections about inspections?
Not really, no. In my platoon, I think I was in the third row. And since I was about 5 feet, perhaps 8 inches at that time, um, just over 2 meters and something. I would not have commanded much attention, nor would I have been able to see very much. Um, and one tended to be internal. In other words, if you were if you were in the ranks, say for example, look at the gentleman on the extreme right.
Mm-hmm.
He's looking straight forward. His rifle is at his side. His hand is at his side. He's wearing a cartridge belt. Um, what would he have been thinking? Almost nothing except to be on an anticipating basis, whereby if someone came to him and spoke to him, he had to be prepared to speak up, and he didn't know what the question might be. So, in a sense, his mind might have been completely neutral, just standing there waiting for someone to suddenly show up in front of him, and all the rest would have been the same thing. Well, in my case, uh, I think I might have been doing a little bit more thinking as to when it was going to be over or something like that, but not nothing particularly significant.
Another one?
That looks like that looks like Colonel Woods, the camp commander. So this means that it's there's something else too. See those three men with the stripes?
Mm-hmm.
These were probably very close pioneers who had come through boot camp and were the first ones to be promoted. Um, it it this is very definitely is in either December of 1942 or January of 1943.
Mm-hmm.
No, yeah, 1943, because they're the first ones to be promoted to private first class. Yeah. And they probably were going to be uh, assistant drill instructors. They would have been called acting jacks.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. I'm also looking at the position of their stripes. Conceivably, they had to put those stripes on themselves because they're not uniform.
Mm-hmm.
If you notice,
Yeah.
there's a slight inconsistency in the tilt of the uniform itself, of the stripe itself. Yeah, hmm
A similar one?
that's the same flight, that same photo. Yeah, and this this I believe it might have been Colonel Woods. I'm not certain. Yeah, yeah. I guess it is. Yes, yes,
Machine gun training?
yes. Machine gun training, but
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to determine where they're firing from. It was necessary to go to the other camp for
Mm-hmm.
firing because there was no firing um, line firing site on the the Montford Point
Mm-hmm.
campsite. But there are only two of them, and the question is why. And the other thing is they're being supervised by an African American Marine, and so this suggests that something was going on that was rather moving forward. It might have been a change in time. It might have been in 1943, whereby they were just beginning to set up. But are those stones in back concrete at the sites? Can you tell what they're made of?
I would guess this is concrete.
Yes,
Um, and these are sandbags.
yes, yes,
Also these.
yes. Hmm. That's a story in itself, I guess. Again,
Yeah.
here's a camp much built up, and so
Mm-hmm.
you're getting close to 1944, and
Yeah.
it might even have been 1944.
This we have seen. Yeah.
Yes. What seems a little strange is if this is the colonel in charge of the camp,
Mm-hmm.
I I don't see him at that rank as being out there examining the men's rifles. This must have been a lower ranking officer. Does it seem logical to you?
Could be. Hmm.
Yes, yeah. It just seemed illogical that a man of the let's see that large picture of the. Now I'm trying to figure out where. Well, look at the chairs, the type of chairs they're using,
It seems to be
and
foldable chairs.
yes, folding,
Uh,
yeah, folding chairs. The other thing, of course, is they what else? There seemed to be such a large number, and the question is, where would they have been? I don't. I can't think of a building that would
Looks
it's a
that.
looks like a
yeah,
court, like a
yeah.
basketball court. There's a basketball
Oh yes,
hoop.
it is a gym. It is a gym,
Mm-hmm.
gymnasium,
Mm-hmm.
gymnasium. Um, I I can't remember that particular site on the
Mm-hmm.
camp on the campgrounds unless it was built after I left.
Mm-hmm.
Now they were still the camp was still growing when I left because it was less than let's see it was not even 2 years old when I left. Yeah, of going overseas, and there's um,
Mm-hmm.
the organist again, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any of those photos that I don't see anyone that I recognize.
Yeah.
Again, in the center here is the former headquarters of the
Mm-hmm.
commanding officer of the camp of Montford Point Camp,
Yeah.
and it's now the museum and the library, and they have many more documents
Mm-hmm.
than the headquarters Marine Corps, the headquarters Marine Corps History Division would show. Yeah.
So this is
This is a
yeah.
tank, yes. The first group, the composite,
Mm-hmm.
did have tanks. And one of the stories is that the 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 little town nearby, Jacksonville, was a very, very prejudiced type of town and went out of their way to show their distaste, what have you, a fear of African Americans. They even the headquarters of the Marine Corps said that they were scared of us and didn't know how to
Mm-hmm.
handle us, which sounds strange when you think of the what might have been one of the most powerful armies in the world talking about being afraid of its own citizens. Why would they be afraid of their own citizens? Is it because they have done something that they knew had drawn the hatred of of their fellow American citizens, or is it that they were weak on something, or that these other American citizens were stronger, or what have you? It when one stops to try to analyze it, it becomes somewhat difficult, if not impossible. But those were the times, and so in today's world, you have to conclude that maybe there was some lack of intelligence or something. But in the South, of course, because people had been in slavery and more knowledge of the abuses of it were circulating, not to mention the fact that people no longer knew where their mothers or fathers or sisters and brothers were because they were sold off like they were chattel. Um, it must have made people very, very hostile and sometimes an unexpressed hostility because to be known as being hostile meant that you were automatically subject to reprisals, which meant either sale or brutality or even death because the since you were chattel, there was no necessity for accounting for your demise or something. You could be reported as having died suddenly, and that was it. No one was interested in why you died. Not even regular medicine was up at that point. But
That's a
as I, as I
brutal reality.
yeah, as I say, the town was very hostile. Sometimes the men who had to get back before a certain time or were charged with a crime for not failing to return on time because the taxis would not take them to the gate or something. Um, anyway, one of the men from Montford Point had been brutalized, and so they, the men who were receiving the tanks, came down the street, this newly paved street, and suddenly someone yelled, "We're going the wrong way!" And they turned around, and by going around, it meant that suddenly they, how do you say it? They were torn up. The streets were torn up, you might say. Yeah. Hmm. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, there's
Mm,
and this is someone using a radio.
mm.
Yeah. Those are just beginning to come into vogue at the time. Yeah. Oh, this is one of the officers. I can't recognize him. Yeah. It may have been the senior officer there. He was, by the way, this gentleman was so popular. He was, in a sense, almost revered and described as the great white father because he he did not allow the men to be taken advantage of in terms of denigrating them to servitude, you might say, if I might use those kind of words. Yeah. He fought for them as true Marines,
Mm,
for which he took an awful lot of abuse and humiliation, especially from his superiors. In those days, if a white person tended to, many of them, if they tended to be fair or impartial or kind to black folks, they were used as a slur as being a Negro lover, and they were insulted in their communities, or
mm,
you might say humiliated in their communities. And so this gentleman, although the top person, and he had been in the Marine Corps 26 years, was still subject to mistreatment from his superiors.
mm,
At one point, the head of the overall camp, who was 2 stars, and he was an eagle, asked him to send him 100 Negro laborers. 100 Negro laborers. He's talking about Marines now.
mm,
He's asking him for 100 Negro laborers. And it went through headquarters Marine Corps and back down to this colonel. And he, he kind of bowed out and told him he didn't have any such. Yeah.
mm,
Now this is the quartermaster whereby you receive all of
mm,
your gear. And notice the young man in front is still wearing his civilian
mm,
clothes. Yes. And over in the background, he's being measured for shoes. We call those type of shoes boondocks. Yeah.
mm,
And
mm,
if you notice, it's very early in the game because this gentleman seems to be white, which means that they still have the white leaders,
mm,
enlisted leaders on campus. Yeah. The three of them, they were taking care of the supplies that they're getting for
mm,
uniforms and so forth. But in the nature of things, if you see 3 men, 4 men behind the counter, it seems like a waste of energy that you would have that many men just to serve men coming in for training. But in fact, there's more than that because if you count the gentleman who's measuring him for shoes, that becomes a little bit unusual.
yeah.
And
Mm.
again, this is what is that? Are those
It's
packs in front of them?
another radio.
Yeah, I think it's a
Another,
radio. Yeah.
yeah. And this is, I guess they were. This might have been the either the 51st or the 52nd because those of us who were in the ammunition companies and the depot companies let's see, maybe the I again, I'm not quite sure how they communicated on the battle front, but they would have needed something to communicate unless they just walked it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay. So these
yeah.
were the.
I know that this thing said that it would give out of power in 10 minutes. So if it does, I'll just switch over to see if I can switch over to my telephone. Yeah.
Okay. So these were the photos I wanted to show you.
Yes. 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 Those are interesting. I'd never seen those photos before. I don't think. Yeah. Some of them I saw. Some I've seen before. Yeah. Hmm.
Mm.
I I don't think you need to switch, Theodore, because this is the basically the end of our interview here.
It's been good to
Uh,
meet you guys and to see you and to be over there and all of their hot spots
Mhm.
and all that business, the Finisterre.
we want to
Did that
we
still
Mhm.
exist? Does it still exist? The Finisterre?
The
Or
need
do you know the Finisterre? Oh, that's right though. You're
yeah,
from Utrecht and this is in
yeah.
Amsterdam. And
uh,
Amsterdam is the New York City of the Netherlands.
Yeah.
it
Hmm.
is. Yeah.
You guys are from the country.
You got, yeah.
Actually, I'm not from the Netherlands. I'm from
Hmm.
Brazil. I'm
From
in Brazil.
Brazil.
Yes, yes.
Oh, excuse
We are
me.
Hmm.
partners from
Yes,
across the Atlantic.
yes. And everybody in Brazil lives in Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do live in São Paulo. Do you know São Paulo? You ever hear about it?
Yes, I know San
Yes.
Paulo very well. I've never been there, but I know that's a very much a Japanese enclave.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's
Yes.
true. That's
But
true.
in addition, at one time, when I was stationed in Barbados, I proposed to the Barbadians that they make a business of cultivating the flying fish
Hmm.
because
Oh.
there was a great market for them in Sao Paulo with
Oh, all
Japanese.
right.
But they they could not see that. It just seemed that the only way to catch flying fish was by going out in the oceans when they come up, as opposed to cultivating them or domesticating them. Yeah,
Yeah.
but if you don't know business, you don't know how to make a profit.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Ah, that's true. That's true.
yeah.
So
But Sao
so
Paulo is one of the special places in Brazil.
Hmm.
Yeah.
yeah, yes, it's the biggest city around here. So
So it's overcome Rio de Janeiro.
oh yes, we have around 20 million people in São Paulo.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big city, very big city.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would like to thank you for your time, for your service, for your history. I appreciate that your memory is still so vivid, so alive, and that's quite impressive. I really loved to listen to the stories, not only the World War II stories, but also the segregation and all of that. It's extremely interesting to listen to nowadays that things have changed so much.
Yes.
And thank you very much, Theodore.
Yeah.
We really, really appreciate your time.
Well, it's interesting. Just before you came on, I was I had sent a note to one of my colleagues who had done a paper, and it was full of inaccuracies. And one was where this man, who was a public relations man, spoke of the fact that we came into the Marine Corps to fight for racial equality. And I said, wait a minute, does this assume that we were unequal?
Yeah,
And by the same token, if we then achieve it, how would we know it?
that's
Or how do
true.
we know? How do we know that we were unequal? Unequal to what? To
Hmm.
whom?
To whom? Yeah, perfect.
So I said, please, I think you got to look at your terminology. And
Yeah, perfect. So,
uh,
Samuel,
I again, I wanted to thank you for being on the show. Thank you for spending this time with us, and yeah.
well, I want to thank you for educating me. Those photos, for the first time I'd ever seen photos of Dutch Marines, although I had been introduced to the subject and I'm still trying to find out some more details of it. I thought that perhaps in those days the Dutch may have included some of its colonists in their ranks, and therefore offended the white Marines of this particular area. For example, the St. Martin, the
Mhm.
ABC Islands, Dutch Guiana, and so forth. Not to mention Indonesia and all these other places who might have had
Mhm.
darker skins, and thereby automatically created a problem with the Marines over here who all had white skins and what have you.
Yeah.
But why you should be afraid of a fellow human being? I've I've seen it before. In fact,
Yeah.
going into China, I noticed that well, sometimes the Chinese who had never seen a person of darker skin would be curious enough to come over
Mhm.
and want to touch them. And for some reason, I never had them to do it because I quickly learned Chinese
Mhm.
myself, and
Okay.
so I could tell them and know in certain terms. You must be crazy. Do I come over and touch your skin or something? But anyway, you live and
Yeah,
learn. You live and learn. You live.
that's true.
And because I read a lot, I do learn an awful lot. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
true. All right. Very,
Yeah.
very good then. So finish it up, Sam.
Well, once more, thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for talking to us about your experiences during the Second World War and your experiences with the Montford Marine. And I want to thank the audience
Yes.
for listening to this part of the interview.
Well, one day you must call again and let's talk about what's happening over here and the rest of the world because we're kind of in a sense of turmoil at this moment and mental turmoil and
Mm.
verbal turmoil. Not physical
Yeah,
completely yet, but it's interesting to see what's going on. As long as I'm at room temperature and I can
yeah.
still talk about it.
Okay,
All right.
have a nice day. Thank you.
All
Bye
right.
bye.
Okay.
Hello there. Thank you very much for watching until the end. If you liked the video, please leave it a like. If you didn't like, unlike it and tell us in the comments how we can improve. Don't forget to subscribe because that supports us a lot. And stay tuned for more here in the World War II Daily podcast. Thank you very much. I'll see you on the next one.